Eviction tsunami looming. Millions face homelessness as moratorium ends. The clock is ticking. The eviction moratorium is set to expire. Millions face eviction as moratorium ends Saturday. This is an eviction tsunami. With the federal eviction moratorium expiring over the weekend, some renters are worried they'll soon be without a place to live. Welcome to the biggest eviction horror show in U.S. history. Filled with displaced people and their assets, I wonder what the streets will look like in the next 90 days. Same for people that have defaulted on their mortgages. Mortgage moratoriums have ended as well. Millions of homeless coming to a street near you. Many of them lost jobs during the pandemic and had fallen months behind on their rent. They lost their jobs because the government shut down the economy, which resulted in a lot of small companies going out of business. And then to compound the problem, the government kept extending the unemployment benefits long after opening the economy back up. So that when the few small businesses that survived opened back up, they couldn't find anyone willing to work for them. After all, why work when you're getting paid not to? And now the few small businesses that survived the shutdown are finally going under also. And then the government again made problems worse by placing a moratorium on rent. So now there are all kinds of business properties and home rental properties that have gone into default and are being bought up by the rich elites for pennies on the dollar. This is exactly what the elitists had in mind. A transfer of wealth and property from the middle class to them. Soon they will own everything and we will own nothing. Mission accomplished. Our government is very evil. They are not looking out for our best interests. They are looking to further enrich themselves at our expense so they can rule over USA. Historic eviction crisis looms over America. At least about 3.6 million Americans face the risk of literally being thrown out of their homes as an 11-month-long moratorium on evictions that was put in place due to the pandemic has now expired. Now, just hours before the moratorium's expiration, the Congress erased on Friday to try and extend the ban in a long-shot effort to prevent millions of Americans from being evicted from their homes amidst an ongoing COVID-19 surge. The United States' federal moratorium on the eviction of tenants who fell behind on rent during the pandemic is set to expire this weekend. The protection had prevented landlords from evicting tenants who fell behind on their payments during the pandemic. But the U.S. Congress has failed to pass a last-minute extension, leaving millions of Americans with the threat of losing their homes, as COVID-19 sees a resurgence across the country. Latest figures from the U.S. Census Bureau show 10 million Americans are behind in their rent. Not only are these people going to be evicted, many of them do not have an adequate work history to satisfy a landlord's application once they are evicted, and many have no jobs at all. Lots have lost their careers. You cannot rent a home without a job. The homeless crisis in the U.S. is about to get exponentially worse. Add the soon-to-be newly evicted to those who can't afford their rent because rent just went up from $100 to $800 a month. The poor people on fixed incomes are going to feel rate increases like a Muhammad Ali punch to the gut. Not good, no matter how you look at it. And anyone asking about these modest landlords that still have to pay their mortgage while getting no rent? The landlords themselves may be going broke. They have expenses of their own. We need to understand that those landlords still have mortgages to pay to, and a year and a half of non-payments is harsh. Many of the rental properties will go to ruin. This happened at a smaller scale in New York City in the 1970s. A year and a half of unemployment or working minimum wage jobs to support yourself and your kids because you got laid off from your career due to COVID is also harsh, and the government should be held responsible for every person left homeless. It is not the pandemic that creates the crisis, but rather the government's restrictions and lockdowns. The complete shutdown of society in a failed attempt to stop the virus from spreading sure has had some devastating effects. Few are getting big chunks of the stimulus package, and many others can't have a roof above their heads. What an irony it is. The more lockdowns, the more homeless. The more homeless, the more crime. The more crime, the more disproportionate suffering. The more disproportionate suffering, the more racial division. The more racial division, the more violence. The more violence, the more force justified for control. Most people don't recall the many violent clashes fought by communists and anarchists against the police during the Weimar Republic. Faced with chaos, the human mind cries out for order, and in excess, order naturally gives way to tyranny. Nothing throughout recorded history has ever made the rich so much richer as these lockdowns. Remember that. The restrictions that will cause the coming problems were implemented by the government were and are completely unnecessary, improved nothing. Hence the government caused the problem. More likely than not, intentionally, with an eye to corporate control of private property and government control of corporate power. It is kinda weird that following a pandemic, huge unemployment, hundreds of thousands occupying graves not homes, astronomical private and public debts from government-sponsored degeneracy. There is too much government, corporate and vested financial interest impeding free markets. Too much concentrated wealth and power. Just quit subsidizing vested interests and get out of the way of the building process to allow the building of as much housing as viable, and the affordability part will take care of itself. Most of the real estate and rental affordability problems could be resolved if the Federal Reserve wasn't intentionally blowing an asset bubble. Same for foreign central banks, where their own bubbles, such as in China, incentivize and make it affordable for their citizens to outbid Americans. U.S. government policy also intentionally inflates the price of housing. Housing would be much cheaper without loan guarantees, FNMA, GNMA, bank deposit insurance, tax subsidies, flood insurance, restrictive local zoning. It's a lot more than government meddling in the private real estate market. It's government meddling in the financial markets, with money being funneled toward private equity, Blackstone and others, via behavior control through tax deferment for 401ks and pension plans. Of course, the ultimate is Fed meddling, creating money from nothing and loaning to insiders at low interest rates. The bane of capitalism is concentrated wealth and power. The bane of any free people and free markets is concentrated wealth and power. You combine corporatism, limited liability and money concentration, with a Fed that gets to allocate money and credit and pick winners and losers. You get what we are getting. A financialized nation heading toward a tiered system with a good supply of debt and wage slaves. Exactly what the masters want. Rent seekers as an economic term. A college professor as a rent seeker as a government bureaucrat. In short, rent seekers are at best parasitic as they seek wealth without contributing to production. When the rent seekers are armed with fiat from central banks at 0% interest rate, the substance of an economy will be eaten. The counterbalance to this is the natural interest rate that connects production and wealth. This rate is 3%. If old dead economists are correct, the result will be ugly. This is an old true story. Nothing has been discovered. Broadly speaking, there are only producers and consumers in an economy, period. Rent-seeking is neither good nor bad. It is a simple classification to try to model an economy as to what side of the equilibrium an activity falls. Parasitic behavior arises from the denial of the natural interest rate, which is the time value of money. Only the sovereign has the power to deny. The Fed's mission is to keep the parasitic balls of debt in the air. The equilibrium between consumer, investment, and producer has always been an opportunity to extract wealth without production. This is called government, and it has worked great for them. This process of wealth extraction is carried out by a devious and manipulative cadre of people we call the politician. Seems obvious that while government is assuming responsibility for the flow of consumer income, that private enterprise will step in front of them. Inflation would happen. Always figured that when the government buys dinner, the vendors raise prices, and the consumers paying cash pony up the difference, but that never really happened. The incentive to be a landlord in the era of rent controls is what exactly? The excess supply comes to market and your bottom line takes a hit. Then the government has to bail you out. The only people who seem to be heading in the right direction are the gold bugs. They know the money is no good. Personally, I am implacably opposed to any open-ended unlimited entitlements, whether for the rich or the poor. The most extreme example is what we have with monetary policy and the Federal Reserve Board put benefiting the most affluent the most. More generally, the rent moratoriums, mortgage forbearance, and additional unemployment where the government has no clue whether the recipients are in need and doesn't care either. It doesn't matter who's in charge of our government any longer. We are so far gone that a gigantic reset cannot be avoided. You don't have to go back to the Roman Empire. Go back 100 years. We are like the Austrian-Hungarian Empire in 1912, 1913, 1914. Every institution in our country is corrupt and rotting from the inside out. Read Geoffrey Worrow's excellent book, The Mad Catastrophe, a detailed accounting of what happened there taken from accurate sourcing from his ancestors and historical records. Everything that happened there is happening here in the USA. America is now an oligarchy with a few at the top, a vast underclass, and an eviscerated and ever-shrinking middle class. In America, the top 1% now own nearly 40% of the nation's wealth. The wealth distribution in the United States has more in common with an emerging economy like Mexico or Brazil. Many landlords are already leaving the rental business. That's why they came up with the moratorium in the first place. Do you think they did this because they cared about the little guy? No, they did it so a lot of property owners would lose their property and free up a lot of real estates. But the property won't be handed over to the government. The banks that own the property will sell it to their rich elite friends for pennies on the dollar. People like Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg, just to name a few. Like Klaus Schwab said, we will own nothing and be happy. We being the little people.